Thomas Hartwell woke up at 5 in the morning, just like he had for the past 15 years. The old alarm clock on his nightstand barely made a sound before he switched it off. He didn't need it anymore. His body knew when to wake up. The sun wasn't even thinking about rising yet, but Thomas was already pulling on his worn jeans and checking boots. The house felt cold and empty as he walked through it. It was a big house built by his grandfather back in the 1940s. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen big enough for a large family, and a living room with windows that looked out over the rolling hills of Montana. But Thomas lived in just 1 bedroom now. The others stayed closed, collecting dust and memories he tried not to think about. He made coffee in the kitchen the same way he had for years. 3 scoops of ground coffee, water from the well, and wait for it to brew. No sugar, no cream. Just black coffee that would wake him up and keep him going until lunch. The kitchen table was small now. He'd put the big family table in storage after Margaret died. What was the point of a table that could seat 8 when only one person was eating? Outside, the Montana sky was starting to show the first hints of dawn. Thomas put on his heavy coat and stepped onto the porch. The air was so cold it made his breath come out in white puffs. February in Montana wasn't kind to anyone, but Thomas had gotten used to it. He'd gotten used to a lot of things over the years. The barn was about 100 yards from the house. Thomas walked the same path he'd walked thousands of times before. His boots crunched on the frozen ground. In the distance, he could see his cattle huddled together against the cold. They were good cattle, healthy and strong. Thomas took pride in his herd. They were Black Angus, the kind that did well in cold weather and brought good money at market. Inside the barn, Thomas started his daily routine. Feed for the horses, hay for the cattle, check the water systems to make sure nothing had frozen overnight. The work kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. That's how Thomas liked it. He didn't want to think too much. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to pain he'd rather avoid. His horse Thunder was a 15-year-old quarter horse with a gentle nature and steady temperament. Thomas saddled him up and rode out to check on the cattle. The ranch covered 800 acres, and there was always something that needed fixing or checking. A fence post that had come loose, a water tank that needed cleaning, cattle that had wandered too far from the main herd. As Thomas rode across his land, he thought about how different his life had turned out from what he'd planned. He and Margaret had bought this ranch when they were young and full of dreams. They were going to raise cattle and children. They were going to fill that big house with laughter and love. They talked about having 4 or 5 kids, maybe more. Margaret would garden and cook, and Thomas would teach the children how to ride horses and take care of the animals. But life had other plans. Margaret got sick 3 years after they bought the ranch. Cancer, the doctor said. They fought it for 2 years, trying every treatment, spending every dollar they had saved. But in the end, the cancer won. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning, in October, holding Thomas's hand and telling him she loved him. After the funeral, Thomas thought about selling the ranch. What was the point of keeping all that land and all those dreams when the person he'd shared them with was gone, but he couldn't do it? This place was all he had left of the life he'd planned. So he stayed and he worked, and he tried not to think about what might have been. The years passed slowly. Thomas learned to live alone. He cooked simple meals, did his own laundry, and kept the house clean enough to live in. He didn't have visitors. His few friends from town stopped calling after a while. Thomas didn't blame them. He wasn't much company anymore. He'd forgotten how to make small talk, how to laugh at jokes, how to be around people who weren't grieving. The ranch did well, though. Thomas was good with cattle, and he knew how to manage land. He sold his beef to buyers who paid good prices, and he saved most of what he earned. There wasn't much to spend money on when you lived alone and never went anywhere. Thomas had enough saved to live comfortably for the rest of his life, but comfort wasn't the same as happiness. Sometimes late at night when the wind was howling, outside and the house felt especially empty, Thomas would walk through the other bedrooms. He'd left them just the way Margaret had decorated them. The guest room had blue walls and white curtains. The room they'd planned as a nursery still had the rocking chair Margaret had picked out, sitting in the corner with a blanket folded on the seat. Thomas would stand in these rooms for a few minutes. remembering what it felt like to have hope. Then he'd go back to his own room and try to sleep. Morning always came, and with it more work to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. The neighbors knew Thomas as the quiet rancher who kept to himself. When they saw him in town buying supplies, he was polite but didn't linger to chat. The woman at the grocery store would ask how he was doing, and he'd say fine and pay for his groceries. The man at the feed store would talk about the weather, and Thomas would nod and load his truck. People respected his privacy, but they also worried about him. It wasn't natural for a man to live so alone for so long. Dr. Peterson, the local veterinarian, who came out to check on Thomas's cattle, was one of the few people who still tried to get Thomas to open up. "You can't live like a hermit forever, Tom," he'd say, while examining a pregnant cow. "Margaret wouldn't want you to shut yourself off from the world." Thomas would just shrug and change the subject to something about the cattle. He appreciated Dr. Peterson's concern, but the vet didn't understand. Thomas wasn't shutting himself off from the world by choice. The world just felt too big and too loud without Margaret in it. The quiet of the ranch was the only thing that made sense anymore. Winter was always the hardest time. The days were short and cold, and there was less work to do outside. Thomas would spend long evenings in his living room, reading books about cattle ranching or watching old movies on his small television. He had satellite TV, but mostly watched the Weather Channel and farming shows. Comedies didn't seem funny anymore, and love stories just reminded him of what he'd lost. The house had good insulation and a reliable heating system, but Thomas often felt cold anyway. It was the kind of cold that came from loneliness, the kind that no amount of firewood could fix. He'd wrap himself in the quilt Margaret had made and sit in his recliner, listening to the wind outside and the settling sounds of an old house. On this particular February evening, Thomas had finished his chores early. A storm was coming in from the west, and the weather service was predicting heavy snow and dangerous winds. Thomas had brought the horses into the barn and made sure all the cattle were in the lower pasture, where they'd have some protection from trees and hills. He'd checked the generator and made sure he had enough food and water in case the power went out. Now he was sitting in his living room, drinking a cup of coffee, and watching the snow start to fall outside his window. The flakes were big and heavy, the kind that meant business. Thomas had seen enough Montana storms to know this one was going to be bad. He was glad he lived alone and didn't have to worry about anyone else getting home safely. The wind was picking up, rattling the windows and making the old house creak. Thomas finished his coffee and decided to go to bed early. There wasn't much point in staying up when there was nothing to do but watch the storm get worse. He turned off the lights, checked that the doors were locked, and headed to his bedroom. He was getting ready for bed. Thomas heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it sounded like a car engine. Thomas frowned and looked out his bedroom window. He couldn't see any headlights, and the road to his ranch was almost a mile long. Who would be driving in weather like this? The sound came again, closer this time. Thomas pulled on his jeans and boots and grabbed a flashlight. He put on his heavy coat and stepped out onto the porch. The snow was falling so thick he could barely see the barn. The wind was strong enough to knock a person down if they weren't careful. Thomas made his way toward the barn, following the sound of the engine. As he got closer, he could see that the big barn doors were slightly open. That was strange. Thomas always made sure those doors were closed tight in bad weather. The wind could slam them around and damage the hinges. He pushed one of the doors open wider and shined his flashlight inside. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. There was an old van parked inside his barn, steam rising from under its hood. And huddled near the back of the barn, trying to stay warm in the hay, was a woman and 7 children. The woman looked up when the light hit her face. She was young, maybe in her 30s, with dark hair and eyes that held both fear and determination. Her clothes were thin for such cold weather, and Thomas could see she was very pregnant. The children ranged from what looked like a teenager down to a baby that couldn't be more than 2 years old. They were all shivering, and their faces were pale with cold. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment, not knowing what to say. He'd gotten so used to being alone that finding 8 people in his barn felt like discovering aliens. The woman struggled to her feet, one hand on her pregnant belly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaky. The walk from the barn to the house felt like the longest 100 yards of Thomas's life. He led the way with his flashlight, making sure the path was safe for the pregnant woman and children following behind him. The wind was so strong it tried to knock them sideways, and the snow was falling so thick that Thomas could barely see his own front porch. Behind him, he could hear the children talking quietly in Spanish. The woman was speaking to them in a calm voice, probably telling them everything would be okay. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. It was the same way Margaret used to talk to scared animals, gentle and reassuring. When they reached the porch, Thomas held the door open and watched as 8 strangers filed into his house. The warmth hit them immediately, and he could see the relief on their faces. The baby stopped crying, and the children looked around with wide eyes at the big living room with its comfortable furniture and warm lights. The woman was the last to come inside. She paused in the doorway and looked at Thomas. "I'm Elena Rodriguez," she said. "These are my children. We're very grateful for your kindness." Thomas nodded and closed the door against the storm. "Thomas Hartwell," he said. "This is my ranch." Now that they were inside and he could see them clearly, Thomas got a better look at the family that had appeared in his barn. Elena looked to be in her mid-30s, with long dark hair and tired eyes. Her coat was too thin for Montana weather, and she moved carefully because of her pregnancy. Thomas guessed she was about 8 months along. The oldest child was a boy who looked to be around 16. He was tall and skinny, with serious eyes that reminded Thomas of himself at that age. The boy stayed close to his mother, ready to help if she needed anything. Next to him was a girl who might have been 14, with braids and a protective way of watching the younger children. Then, there were the little ones, twin girls who couldn't be more than 6 or 7, holding hands and looking around the room, with curious eyes. A boy who was maybe 5 and another girl who looked about 3. The baby Elena was carrying couldn't have been more than 18 months old, with chubby cheeks and big dark eyes. All of them were too thin, Thomas noticed, and their clothes, while clean, were worn and patched. They looked like people who had been traveling for a while, people who didn't have much money and had been making do with whatever they could find. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked because he didn't know what else to say. In his experience, when you didn't know what to do, feeding people was usually a safe choice. Elena's face showed relief. "The children haven't eaten since this morning. We were trying to get to Billings before the storm hit, but our van started overheating about 10 miles back. We walked until we saw your barn." Thomas looked out the window at the blizzard raging outside. 10 miles in this weather, with a pregnant woman and small children. They were lucky to be alive. "Kitchen's this way," Thomas said, leading them through the house. The kitchen was the one room in the house that Thomas had kept exactly the way Margaret had left it. Yellow walls, white cabinets, and a big wooden table that he'd brought out of storage without really thinking about why. The room felt different with people in it, more like it was supposed to be. Thomas opened the refrigerator and realized he had a problem. He was used to cooking for one person, and his usual grocery shopping reflected that. He had eggs, some bacon, bread, and milk. There were canned goods in the pantry, but not enough to feed 8 extra people for what might be several days. "Don't have a lot of food in the house," Thomas admitted. "Been living alone for a long time, but I can make eggs and toast for tonight, and tomorrow when the storm clears, I'll get more supplies." "Please don't worry about feeding all of us," Elena said quickly. "We have some food in the van, the children can share." "No," Thomas said, more firmly than he'd intended. "You're guests in my house. I'll figure something out." He started pulling things out of the refrigerator and pantry: eggs, bacon, bread, a can of beans, some potatoes he could fry up. It wasn't fancy, but it would fill empty stomachs. The oldest boy, who Elena introduced as Diego, offered to help. Thomas was surprised to find that Diego knew his way around a kitchen and could fry bacon without being told how. While they cooked, the other children sat around the kitchen table. The twin girls whispered to each other in Spanish, occasionally giggling. The 3-year-old, whose name was Ana, climbed up onto Elena's lap and fell asleep almost immediately. The 5-year-old boy, Miguel, watched everything Thomas did with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a real cowboy?" Miguel asked in English that was careful but clear. Thomas smiled, just a little. It was the first time he'd smiled in longer than he could remember. "I'm a rancher. I raise cattle." "Do you have horses?" asked one of the twin girls. Elena said her name was Sophia and her sister was Isabella. "3 horses," Thomas said, cracking eggs into a pan. "Can we see them?" Sophia asked. "When the storm's over," Thomas promised. As they ate the simple meal of eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and toast, Thomas learned more about the family that had landed in his barn. Elena had been married to a man named Roberto, who had died in a construction accident 6 months ago. They'd been living in Arizona, but after Roberto died, money got tight and Elena couldn't afford the rent on their apartment. She'd heard there was work in North Dakota, in the oil fields. Not for her, because of the pregnancy, but for Diego, who was old enough to work. The plan was to drive north, find a place to live, and start over. But their old van had been giving them trouble for days, and when the storm hit, they'd run out of options. "We've been sleeping in the van for 3 nights, Elena said quietly, while the children finished eating. "I was so scared when it broke down. I didn't know what we were going to do." Thomas looked at the children around his table. They were eating like they hadn't had a good meal in days, which they probably hadn't. The baby had woken up and was drinking from a bottle that Elena had warmed up with water from Thomas's kitchen tap. The older children were talking quietly among themselves, and for the first time since they'd arrived, they looked relaxed. "You said you were trying to get to North Dakota?" Thomas asked. Elena nodded. "Diego's heard there's good work there, and the schools are supposed to be good. I want the children to have a chance for a better life." Thomas thought about the long road to North Dakota, about traveling in an old van with 8 people and no money for repairs, about a pregnant woman trying to take care of 7 children while looking for work in a strange place. It seemed like an impossible plan, but he could see the determination in Elena's eyes. She was going to do whatever it took to take care of her family. After dinner, Thomas showed them to the bedrooms. He opened up the rooms he'd kept closed for 15 years and tried not to think about all the dreams that had been stored there, along with the furniture. Elena and the baby would take the room with the double bed. The older girls could share the room with twin beds, the boys could take the 3rd bedroom, and the youngest girls could sleep on the pull-out couch in the living room. "This is too much," Elena said, looking at the clean, warm bedroom with its blue walls and white curtains. "We could all sleep in one room. We don't want to put you out." "House has been empty too long," Thomas said. "Good to have people in it again." He gave Elena clean sheets and towels and showed her where the bathroom was. The children were tired, and the warmth of the house was making them sleepy. Diego helped get the younger ones settled, while Elena fed the baby and got ready for bed herself. Thomas retreated to his own room and tried to process what had happened to his quiet, orderly life in the space of a few hours. His house was full of strangers. There were children sleeping in beds that had been empty for years. A pregnant woman was down the hall and 7 kids were scattered throughout his home. He should have felt overwhelmed or at least inconvenienced. He'd spent 15 years learning to live alone, and now suddenly he wasn't alone anymore. But instead of feeling invaded, Thomas felt something he couldn't quite name. The house felt different with people in it. It felt alive. During the night, Thomas woke up several times to unfamiliar sounds. A child coughing, footsteps in the hallway, Elena getting up to check on the baby. These were the sounds of a house with a family in it, sounds Thomas hadn't heard, in his own home for 15 years. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas heard crying from the living room. He put on his robe and went to check. One of the twin girls was sitting up on the pull-out couch, tears running down her face. Her sister was still asleep next to her. Thomas stood in the doorway, not sure what to do. He didn't know anything about comforting children, but the little girl looked so scared and alone that he couldn't just walk away. "Hey," he said softly, approaching the couch. "What's wrong?" The girl looked up at him with wide eyes. "I had a bad dream," she whispered in English. I dreamed we were still in the snow and we couldn't find anywhere warm. Thomas sat down on the edge of the couch. You're safe now, he said. The house is warm and the storm can't get in here. Are you going to make us leave? She asked. The question hit Thomas like a punch to the chest. This little girl, who couldn't be more than 6 years old, had already learned that adults sometimes made promises they didn't keep, that safe places didn't always stay safe. Thomas woke up the next morning to a sound he hadn't heard in his house for 15 years. Children's laughter. For a moment, lying in bed with his eyes still closed, he thought he was dreaming. But then he heard Elena's voice calling out in Spanish, probably telling the kids to be quieter, and he realized this was real. The storm was still raging outside. Through his bedroom window, Thomas could see snow piling up against the glass and wind bending the trees almost horizontal. Nobody was going anywhere today, and probably not tomorrow either. The weather service had been right about this being a bad one. Thomas got dressed and made his way to the kitchen, following the smell of coffee and the sound of voices. What he found there made him stop in the doorway. Elena was at the stove, cooking something that smelled amazing. The baby was in a makeshift high chair that Diego had created by pushing the kitchen chair up to the table and using pillows for support. The other children were sitting around the table talking and laughing. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," called out Miguel, the 5-year-old. "Mama's making breakfast." "I hope you don't mind," Elena said, turning from the stove with a worried look. "I used some of your eggs and found some cheese in the refrigerator. I'm making scrambled eggs with cheese and peppers. It's not much, but smells good," Thomas said, and he meant it. When was the last time someone had cooked breakfast in his kitchen? When was the last time his kitchen had felt like a place where a family ate together? Sophia, one of the twins, patted the chair next to her. "Sit here, Mr. Thomas. Mama makes the best eggs in the whole world." Thomas sat down, feeling awkward at his own kitchen table. The children chattered around him in a mixture of English and Spanish. Diego was helping serve the younger ones. Isabella was making faces at the baby to keep her entertained. Anna was carefully eating her eggs one tiny bite at a time. "How did everyone sleep?" Thomas asked. "Good," said Miguel. "Your house is really warm. Our van was cold at night, even with all the blankets." Elena shot Miguel a look that said, "Don't talk about that." But Thomas had already heard. They'd been sleeping in their van for who knows how long, probably since they'd left Arizona. 8 people crammed into an old van with no heat and no comfort. After breakfast, the storm was still too dangerous to go outside, so they were all stuck indoors together. Thomas wasn't sure what to do with himself. He was used to spending his days working outside, keeping busy with ranch chores. Being trapped inside with 8 strangers felt strange and uncomfortable. But the children didn't seem to have any trouble finding things to do. Sophia discovered Thomas's collection of old National Geographic magazines and started looking through them, asking questions about every picture. Miguel found a deck of cards in a kitchen drawer and convinced Isabella to teach him a game. Diego offered to help Thomas with any indoor chores that needed doing. The older boy seemed to understand that their family was imposing on Thomas, and he wanted to help however he could. Together, they checked the furnace, made sure the generator was ready in case the power went out, and organized the pantry. Diego was a hard worker and didn't need to be told what to do. He reminded Thomas of himself at that age, serious and responsible beyond his years. "You don't have to work," Thomas told him. "You're a guest here." "Mama taught us to always help when someone's being kind to us," Diego said. "She says kindness should be repaid with kindness." Around noon, the power went out. The house got quiet as the furnace stopped running and the lights went dark. Thomas went to start the generator and soon they had electricity again. But the house felt different somehow, cozier and more intimate with just the generator's power. Elena found some candles in a kitchen drawer and lit them, even though they had electric lights. "It feels more like home with candles," she explained. The soft light made the kitchen feel warm and welcoming, like a place where families gathered to share meals and stories. The afternoon passed in a way Thomas had never experienced. There was always someone talking, always something happening. Anna took a nap on the living room couch, curled up like a kitten. The twins played a clapping game they taught each other, singing a song in Spanish that made Elena smile. Miguel followed Thomas around, asking endless questions about everything he saw. "Why do you live in such a big house all by yourself?" Miguel asked, while Thomas was adding wood to the fireplace. It was an innocent question, the kind a 5-year-old would ask without thinking about whether it might hurt someone's feelings. But it hit Thomas hard. Why did he live in a big house all by himself? Why had he kept all these empty rooms for 15 years? "I used to live here with my wife," Thomas said carefully. "She died a long time ago." Miguel nodded seriously. "Our Papa died too. That's why we had to leave our house and find a new one." The simple way Miguel said it, without drama or self-pity, made Thomas's throat tight. This little boy had lost his father and his home, and here he was, still curious about the world, still ready to trust a stranger who'd taken them in from the storm. That evening, Elena cooked dinner using supplies Thomas had in his pantry and freezer. She made a dish with rice, beans, and some frozen chicken, seasoned with spices she'd found in his cabinet. It was simple food, but it tasted better than anything Thomas had eaten in years. Maybe because he was sharing it with people who were grateful for it. After dinner, the children wanted to hear stories. Elena told them about growing up in Mexico with her grandmother, who knew stories about magical creatures and brave children. The kids listened with wide eyes, even Diego, who pretended to be too old for fairy tales but hung on every word. "Do you know any stories, Mr. Thomas?" Sophia asked. Thomas thought about it. He'd never been much of a storyteller, even when Margaret was alive. But looking at the expectant faces around him, he remembered something his own grandfather used to tell him. "My grandfather told me about the winter he got snowed in with a pack of wolves," Thomas began. It wasn't really a true story, more like a tall tale his grandfather had made up to entertain a young boy. But the children loved it, gasping at the exciting parts and laughing when Thomas imitated the sound of howling wolves. When it was time for the children to go to bed, Thomas found himself helping with the bedtime routine. He showed Miguel how the bathroom light worked and found extra blankets for the twins. It felt strange, but also somehow right, taking care of children in his house. On the second day of the storm, Sophia made a discovery that changed everything. She was exploring the house while the adults were in the kitchen and the other children were playing in the living room. Thomas heard her calling from upstairs, excitement clear in her voice. "Mr. Thomas, come see what I found." Thomas climbed the stairs, wondering what a 6-year-old could have discovered that was so exciting. He found Sophia in the room that had once been Margaret's sewing room, standing in front of an old trunk. "Is this a treasure chest?" Sophia asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Thomas's heart clenched. The trunk held things of Margaret's that he hadn't been able to throw away or give to charity. Her quilts, some books, photo albums from their life together. He'd put everything in the trunk and shoved it in the sewing room, trying to forget it was there. "It's just old stuff," Thomas said, but Sophia was already trying to open it. "Can I look inside? Please? I promise I'll be careful." Thomas wanted to say no. He wanted to close the trunk and send Sophia back downstairs. Those were Margaret's things, private memories that belonged to a life that was over. But looking at Sophia's eager face, he couldn't find the words to disappoint her. "Okay," he said. "But everything has to go back exactly where you found it." Sophia nodded solemnly and opened the trunk. The first thing she pulled out was a photo album. She opened it carefully and gasped at what she saw. "Is this your wife?" she asked, pointing to a picture of Margaret standing in front of the house, smiling at the camera. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "She's beautiful. She looks really nice." "What was her name?" "Margaret." Sophia turned the pages slowly, looking at pictures of Thomas and Margaret when they were young. Their wedding day, vacations they'd taken, pictures of them working around the ranch. Margaret feeding the horses, Margaret in her garden, Margaret laughing at something Thomas had said. "You look happy in these pictures," Sophia said. "We were," Thomas admitted. "Do you miss her?" "Every day." Sophia nodded like she understood completely. "I miss Papa every day too. But Mama says he's still with us in our hearts. and that makes it not hurt so much. Other children had heard the conversation and come upstairs. Soon all of them were gathered around the trunk, looking through Margaret's things with the reverence children save for truly special discoveries. Elena found them there and started to scold the children for going through Thomas's private things, but Thomas stopped her. "It's okay," he said. "Maybe it's time these things saw some light again." The children were fascinated by the quilts Margaret had made. Elena recognized the craftsmanship and explained to the children how much work went into making something so beautiful. They found Margaret's recipe books and her collection of books about gardening and cooking. "She must have been a really good cook," Isabella said, flipping through a recipe book filled with Margaret's handwritten notes. "The best," Thomas said. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Thomas and Elena sat in. The storm finally cleared on the third day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Thomas stepped out onto his porch that morning and saw a landscape that looked like something from a fairy tale. Everything was covered in pristine white, snow that sparkled in the morning sun. The sky was clear and blue, and the air was so crisp it made his lungs feel clean. Behind him, he could hear the children's excited voices as they pressed against the windows, looking out at all that snow. Most of them had never seen anything like it. In Arizona, snow was something that happened in movies, not something you could touch and play in. "Can we go outside now?" Miguel asked, bouncing with excitement. "After breakfast and after you get dressed warmly," Elena said. She looked worried as she watched the children's enthusiasm. They didn't have proper winter clothes, just the light jackets they'd been wearing when they arrived. Thomas looked at the eager faces and made a decision that surprised even him. "I've got some old winter gear in the closet," he said. "Coats and boots from when I was younger and smaller. Might fit some of you." He led them to a closet near the back door where he'd stored things he never thought he'd need again. There were ski jackets from his younger days, snow boots in various sizes, warm hats and gloves. Margaret had insisted on keeping everything, saying, "You never know when you might need it." The children tried on different coats and boots, laughing, as they discovered things that were too big or too small. Diego found a jacket that fit him perfectly. The twins shared a pair of snow boots, taking turns. Miguel put on a hat that came down over his eyes, making everyone laugh. "Now we can go see the horses," Sophia announced. The walk to the barn was an adventure. The snow was knee-deep in some places, and the children had never walked through anything like it. They threw snowballs, made snow angels, and marveled at how their breath made white clouds in the cold air. Thomas's horses were curious about the visitors. Thunder, his old quarter horse, came right up to the fence when he saw the group approaching. The children were amazed by how big and beautiful the horses were. "Can I pet him?" Anna asked, her small voice full of wonder. "Very gently," Thomas said, lifting her up so she could reach Thunder's neck. "Horses like soft touches just like you do." Anna giggled as Thunder's whiskers tickled her palm. Soon all the children wanted to pet the horses, and Thomas found himself giving an impromptu lesson on how to approach and touch the animals safely. "Horses can sense if you're scared or nervous," Thomas explained as Miguel carefully stroked Thunder's nose. "So you have to be calm and gentle. Like people," Elena said, watching from beside the fence. "Yeah," Thomas said. "Like people." Sophia was particularly fascinated by a smaller horse named Star. "She's so pretty," Sophia breathed. "Can I ride her someday?" Thomas looked at the little girl's hopeful face and felt something warm in his chest. "Maybe," he said, "if you stay long enough to learn how." After the horses, Thomas showed them the cattle. The Black Angus were gathered in the lower pasture, dark shapes against the white snow. The children had never seen cows up close before, and they were amazed by how big and calm the animals were. "Do they give milk?" Isabella asked. "These are beef cattle," Thomas explained. "They're raised for meat, not milk. Dairy cows are the ones that give milk." Diego was quiet, but Thomas could see he was taking everything in. The boy had the look of someone who was learning, storing up information he might need later. When they got back to the house, everyone was cold and tired and happy, Elena made hot chocolate while the children changed out of their borrowed winter gear. The kitchen was warm and steamy, full of the sound of children's voices telling their mother about everything they'd seen. "The horses are so big," Miguel said, "and Mr. Thomas says maybe I can learn to ride." "If we stay long enough," Sophia added, giving her mother a meaningful look. Thomas caught Elena's eye across the kitchen. They both knew the question that hung in the air. How long would they stay? When would they leave? Where would they go? That afternoon, Thomas walked out to check on Elena's van. The storm had buried it in snow, but he managed to dig it out enough to take a look at the engine. What he saw wasn't good news. The engine had several problems, not just one simple fix. The radiator was cracked, the water pump was leaking, and there were other issues that would take time and money to repair. When he came back to the house, Elena was waiting for him on the porch. "How bad is it?" she asked. Thomas took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. "Pretty bad. It's going to need a lot of work." Elena's face fell. "How much work?" "More than you can probably afford," Thomas said gently. Elena sat down on the porch step despite the cold. For the first time since she'd arrived, Thomas saw her composure crack. Her hands shook as she covered her face. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly. "I thought if we could just get to North Dakota, everything would work out. But now?" Thomas sat down beside her. "When's the baby due?" 6 weeks, maybe less. I've been having some contractions, but the doctor in Arizona said it was normal." 6 weeks? Thomas looked at this young woman who was trying so hard to take care of 7 children while pregnant and essentially homeless, and he felt something shift inside his chest. "You could stay here," he heard himself saying, "until the baby comes, until you figure out what to do next." Elena looked at him with surprise. "We couldn't impose on you that long. We're strangers who showed up in your barn." "House has plenty of room," Thomas said. "And the children, they brighten the place up." It was true. In just 3 days, the children had transformed his quiet, empty house into something that felt like a home. There was laughter in the hallways, conversation, at the dinner table, the sound of people living and breathing and being together. "I can't pay you rent," Elena said. "I have a little money saved, but I need to keep it for when the baby comes." "Don't want rent," Thomas said. "But Diego's a good worker. Maybe he could help with some ranch chores. And you know how to cook better than I do." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Why would you do this for strangers? Thomas thought about it. Why was he doing this? 3 days ago, he would have said he wanted nothing more than to be left alone. He'd spent 15 years building a life of solitude and silence. But sitting on his porch with Elena, listening to her children's voices from inside his house, he realized that his silent life hadn't been living at all. It had just been existing. "Maybe you're not strangers anymore," he said finally. That evening at dinner, Elena told the children they would be staying at the ranch for a while longer. The reaction was immediate and joyful. Sophia clapped her hands. Miguel cheered. Even Diego, who usually kept his emotions in check, smiled. "Can we really learn to ride the horses?" Anna asked. "We'll see," Elena said, but she was looking at Thomas. "If you want to learn, I can teach you," Thomas said. "But riding horses is serious business. You have to prove you can be responsible and follow rules." "We can do that," Sophia said. "We're really good at following rules." Over the next few days, a routine began to develop. Thomas would get up early and do his morning chores while the family was still sleeping. Then he'd come back for breakfast, which Elena insisted on cooking. The children would help with dishes and tidying up, and then Thomas would take whoever wanted to come with him to check on the animals. Diego proved to be a natural with ranch work. He was strong for his age and willing to learn. Thomas showed him how to feed the cattle, how to check the fences, and how to maintain the equipment. The boy soaked up everything like a sponge, asking intelligent questions and remembering everything he was told. The younger children took turns coming with Thomas on his daily rounds. Miguel loved the horses and begged for stories about ranch life. The twins were fascinated by everything and asked endless questions. Anna was content just to hold Thomas's hand and walk beside him, chattering about whatever came into her 3-year-old mind. Elena made the house feel like a home in ways Thomas had forgotten were possible. She cooked meals that filled the kitchen with wonderful smells. She organized the children's belongings and helped them with their schoolwork. She found ways to make the house more comfortable and welcoming without changing anything important. But it was the evenings that Thomas enjoyed most. After dinner and after the children were settled with homework or games, he and Elena would sit in the living room and talk. Really talk. In a way Thomas hadn't talked to anyone in years. Elena told him about her life with Roberto, about their dreams of giving their children a better future. She talked about the fear of being alone with so many children to care for, and about the strength she found in their love for each other. Thomas found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of in years, about Margaret and their plans for the ranch, about the loneliness of the past 15 years and how he'd convinced himself it was what he wanted, about how different his house felt now that it was full of life. "The children love you," Elena said one evening as they watched the snow fall outside. "They're good kids," Thomas replied. "You've raised them well. Diego talks about you constantly. You've given him hope that there are good men in the world, men who keep their promises and take care of people." Thomas felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm not doing anything special." 2 years had passed since that snowy February night when Thomas found Elena and her children in his barn. Now standing in front of the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time, Thomas could barely recognize the man he used to be. The house around him was alive with activity. Children's voices carried up from downstairs, a mixture of English and Spanish that had become the soundtrack of his daily life. Someone was playing music in the living room. The baby, Carmen, was laughing at something, her delighted giggles echoing through the halls. "Dad, are you almost ready?" Diego called from the bottom of the stairs. "Dad." Thomas smiled every time he heard that word. It had started gradually, with the younger children first. Sophia had begun calling him Papa Thomas, then just Papa. Miguel had followed suit, then Ana and Isabella. Diego had held out the longest, still calling him Mr. Thomas for months, after the others had changed. But eventually, even the serious teenager had started using Dad, and it sounded perfectly natural now. "Almost," Thomas called back, giving his tie one final adjustment. Today was the day he'd been planning for months. Today, he was going to marry Elena Rodriguez, and today, he was going to officially adopt all 8 of her children. The paperwork had been finalized last week, making what everyone already knew to be true into a legal reality. They were a family. Thomas walked downstairs and found controlled chaos in his living room. Elena was putting the finishing touches on Carmen's dress, a tiny white creation that made the 2-year-old look like an angel. The other children were lined up for inspection, fidgeting in their best clothes, while Elena made sure everyone looked perfect. "You look beautiful," Thomas said, and he meant it. Elena turned toward him, and Thomas felt his breath catch, just like it had the first time he'd realized he was falling in love with her. She was wearing a simple white dress, nothing fancy or elaborate, but she looked radiant. Her dark hair was pulled back softly, and she wore a small white flower behind her ear that Sophia had picked from the garden that morning. "You don't look so bad yourself," Elena said with a smile. The transformation of Thomas Hartwell over the past 2 years had been remarkable. The quiet, lonely rancher who had lived in silence had become the center of a bustling, joyful family. The house that had echoed with emptiness now rang with laughter and conversation, and the everyday sounds of people who loved each other. The changes had been gradual. Elena and the children had stayed through the spring, officially because Elena needed time to recover from Carmen's birth and figure out their next move. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that nobody really wanted to think about next moves anymore. They were happy where they were. Thomas had legally hired Diego as a ranch hand, giving the teenager real work and real wages that helped him feel like he was contributing to the family. Diego had grown into the job, learning everything Thomas could teach him about cattle ranching and land management. At 18, he was already talking about going to college to study agriculture, with plans to come back and help run the ranch. The other children had settled into the local school system with enthusiasm. Sophia and Isabella, the twins, had become popular with their classmates and teachers alike. They were bright, curious girls who soaked up knowledge like sponges. Miguel had discovered a talent for math and science, while Ana was showing early signs of artistic ability. Even little Carmen, at 2, was already showing she was going to be as smart and spirited as her siblings. Elena had transformed not just Thomas's house but his entire life. She'd brought warmth and organization to a place that had been cold and lonely for too long. She'd filled his days with purpose beyond just caring for cattle and land. She'd filled his nights with conversation and laughter and the comfortable companionship of someone who truly understood him. And gradually, without either of them planning it or even talking about it directly, Thomas and Elena had fallen in love. It hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been a slow, gentle process built on shared daily life and mutual respect, and the deep satisfaction of working together to raise 8 children. It had been Elena teaching Thomas how to braid hair, and Thomas teaching Elena how to drive the truck. It had been late-night conversations after the children were asleep and early morning cups of coffee before the day began. The moment Thomas knew for certain was a day the previous fall when Anna had gotten sick with a fever. Elena had been up all night with her, and Thomas had found himself pacing the hallway outside Anna's room, worried sick about a little girl who wasn't even his biological daughter, but who felt like his own child in every way that mattered. When Anna's fever finally broke and she smiled at Thomas, calling him Papa, Thomas realized that somewhere along the way he'd stopped thinking of Elena's children as guests in his house. They were his children now, and Elena wasn't just the mother of his children. She was the woman he loved, the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. The proposal had been simple and perfect. Thomas had taken Elena for a walk around the ranch one evening in late summer, ostensibly to check on the cattle, but really because he needed to work up the courage to say what was in his heart. They'd ended up sitting on the fence overlooking the pasture where they'd first taught the children to ride horses, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I've been thinking," Thomas had said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. "That's dangerous," Elena had teased. "I'm serious. I've been thinking about the future, about what I want my life to look like." Elena had turned to look at him, sensing something important in his tone. "I want it to look like this," Thomas had continued, gesturing at the ranch, the house, the life they'd built together. "I want it to be you and me and all the kids for as long as you'll have me. I want to make it official, Elena. I want to marry you, and I want to adopt the children. I want us to be a real family, legally and officially and forever." Elena had been quiet for so long that Thomas started to worry he'd misread everything, that maybe she saw their arrangement as temporary, that maybe she was still planning to move on when she felt more stable. But then she'd smiled, tears running down her face, and said, "I thought you'd never ask." Now standing in his living room surrounded by their children getting ready for their wedding, Thomas marveled at how much his life had changed. The man who had thought he wanted nothing but silence and solitude now couldn't imagine life without the beautiful chaos of a large family. The wedding ceremony was held in the small community church where Thomas had attended services sporadically before Elena came into his life. Now the whole family attended together every Sunday, filling up an entire pew and adding their voices to the hymns and their energy to the community. Dr. Peterson, the veterinarian who had been one of Thomas's few friends during his lonely years, served as best man. Elena's friend Maria, who had driven up from Arizona with her own family for the wedding, was the matron of honor. But it was the children who made the ceremony special. Diego walked Elena down the aisle, tall and proud and serious about his responsibility. The twins were flower girls scattering rose petals and trying not to giggle. Miguel was the ring bearer, carrying the rings on a small pillow with intense concentration. Ana stood with Elena as a junior bridesmaid, beaming with pride, and Carmen, in Thomas's arms, provided a soundtrack of happy babbling throughout the ceremony. When the minister asked if Thomas would take Elena to be his wife, his yes was strong and clear. When Elena promised to love and honor Thomas for the rest of her life, her voice was steady despite the tears in her eyes. but it was when they exchanged the rings Thomas had had specially made, with 8 small stones representing each of the children, that both of them completely lost their composure. These weren't just wedding rings. They were symbols of a family chosen by love rather than created by blood. After the ceremony, the reception was held at the ranch. The community had rallied around the unusual family, and it seemed like half the county had shown up to celebrate. Tables were set up in the big barn, which had been decorated with lights and flowers. The same barn where Thomas had first found Elena, and her children now hosted a party celebrating their new beginning. The children were the stars of the reception. They charmed everyone with their mix of shy politeness and irrepressible enthusiasm. Sophia and Isabella taught some of the other children how to dance to traditional Mexican music. Miguel demonstrated his rope tricks for anyone who would watch. Ana showed off her latest drawing. Diego, looking very grown up in his suit, made a toast that had everyone reaching for their tissues. 2 years ago we were lost, Diego said, standing up with a glass of sparkling cider. We had nowhere to go and no one to help us. Then we found Thomas, or maybe he found us. Either way, he didn't just give us shelter from the storm. He gave us a home. He gave us a dad. And today, he's making it official. Thomas, thank you for showing us that families can be built by love, not just by blood. Thank you for being the father we needed and the man we all want to be like when we grow up. Thomas couldn't speak for several minutes after that toast. He just stood there with Elena's hand in his, looking at the 8 children who had